Hello, you're watching Proactive. I'm joined by Bitwise Asset Management European Head, Bradley Duke. Bradley, Happy New Year. Great to speak with you again. So let's start with Bitcoin's record performance in 2024 and that series of consecutive highs to reach $100,000.
Yeah, Happy New Year, Stephen. Yeah, it was by any measure a very good year for Bitcoin, and I think it's actually worthwhile taking a step back and looking at Bitcoin's performance since January 2023, because we kind of get focused on where we are now, and now that Bitcoin has reached around the 100,000 mark, and we kind of forget the journey, the sort of the let's call it an onward sort of an upward march of Bitcoin since 2023. So in 2024, we entered the year with Bitcoin really outperforming outperforming all other major assets groups, with a 121% return in the calendar year. And that compares to the S&P, which was around 23% return, and gold at about 27, which were the next biggest, let's call it, traditional finance assets. Ethereum also had a great year with about a 45% return for 2024, while other commodities didn't perform as well. It was definitely a good year for investors in Bitcoin and also in cryptocurrencies in general, which is reflected by the 81% performance of the MSCI DA20 capped index performance in 2024.
So although we crossed that $100,000 mark, Bitcoin pulled back slightly towards the end of the year. This week it's been above $100,000, but it's pulled back again. So take us through some of the headwinds that it's currently facing, Bradley.
Yeah, so we're living through a period now in the world of Bitcoin where there is a combination of tailwinds and headwinds working sort of against each other, this sort of push-pull environment that we have. And I'm happy to go through some of those points. So on the one hand, what we have is a strong dollar. And I would say of all the headwinds, that is the biggest headwind that Bitcoin faces. Because what a strong dollar means is it typically leads to a contraction in the money supply. And historically, what we've seen is when there's an expansion, or especially unchecked expansion of global money supply, that is good for the price performance of Bitcoin. People like to move into what they see as a better money, a harder currency in Bitcoin. And so price performance typically of Bitcoin is usually pushed up when there's a expansion of global money supply. So with a strong dollar, we're seeing a contraction of the global money supply, and this is definitely a headwind for Bitcoin. And actually, if you look at a chart with the global money supply lagging by 3 months, and we lag it by 3 months because it takes time for the changes in the money supply to be actually felt. We can see it actually correlates quite tightly to price performance of Bitcoin. So you have that on the one hand, and then on the hand, you have a lot of these tailwinds that are happening. And so some of the tailwinds are, for example, we've spoken about it on this show before, the halving that happened last year in sort of April 2024, that the effects of this halving will only be felt more like around 3-4, especially 400 days after the halving. So we're actually entering into that period now where this reduction in supply of Bitcoin is being felt, and results in prices being pushed up because Bitcoin is becoming scarcer. This is also borne out by the statistics that we've seen from exchanges. The on-exchange balances of Bitcoin continue to fall, and actually, quite precipitously. So there is what this metric actually is measuring, is showing, is that investors are keeping Bitcoin in cold storage rather than putting it on exchange, where where they would keep it if they were expecting to sell the Bitcoin. So you've got that happening, this the scarcity argument really coming into play. At the same time, you've got these headwinds from the strong dollar, and also just from people wanting to take profit as well. Some people, the people, the hodlers who want to buy Bitcoin and don't want to sell it, and then the others who see it as an asset where they've got a price target. When they reach that, they want to take profits. And at 100,000, it's a logical point for people to take profits. So yeah, very interesting dynamics that we're seeing at the moment in the world of Bitcoin.
Bradley, last time we chatted, you said it was possible Bitcoin could reach $200,000 by the end of 2025. Are you sticking to that at the moment?
Yeah, look, I still personally stand by that number, and I think the Bitwise is a company that remains the target for that the company's analysts have set. It's an interesting time now because we find the Fed really stuck between a rock and a hard place at the moment. On the one hand, one of their mandates is to control inflation, and they've got very sort of crude tools in terms of setting rates to try and control that. But at the same time, they are facing a situation where they're trying to slow down inflation, but at the same time, they don't want to stifle growth. The economy, there's really has been a tightening of sort of financial conditions lately, and they really don't want, they're trying to keep the country out of recession, so they trying to really manage this balance between inflation and not stifling growth. They recently announced that there would be only two cuts in 2025. So they're taking a more kind of a wait and see approach. Just also wanted to mention just one point that I forgot to mention as well in terms of Bitcoin, and especially in the US, is the treasury adoption by corporates of Bitcoin has grown considerably. And we've seen there's some 71 or 72 listed companies. Now, these are companies that are stock exchange listed that hold Bitcoin as a treasury asset, and they're doing this because they've seen that companies that do hold Bitcoin, their stock price outperforms the competitors. And of those companies, there's more than 21 companies that hold over 1,000 Bitcoin. So that's $100 million worth of Bitcoin that they hold. And I think this is going to be one of the big, factors that are going to influence this 200,000, potentially 200,000 Bitcoin price in 2025. And that is this phenomenon that we're seeing now globally of corporations starting to include Bitcoin into their treasury policy and to hold Bitcoin. So this is another demand side, factor that's coming into play, along with countries that are, considering holding or have announced that they will hold Bitcoin as a strategic asset as well.
Bradley, maybe moving away from Bitcoin for a moment.
Sure.
Solana, you launched a Solana staking ETP back in December. It trades on the Xetra DEX. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so this new product, so as you mentioned, it's the ticker is BSOL. It's on Xetra board in Germany, and which is the largest and most liquid ETF exchange presently in Europe. And it follows the same kind of structuring that we used for ET32, the Bitwise Ethereum staking ETP, insofar as that we are very open about how much of the product is staked. There's transparency for that, and also the fact that it is a total return product. So the staking rewards are compounded and reinvested back into sort of the NAV of the product, so to help the product's performance over time. It is measured against a third-party benchmark, the performance. And also we're using Marinade as a staking provider so they are actually providing the staking services for Solana staking. We chose them because we've seen that they have using some very smart tech. We can have a whole discussion about that, but it'll take a really long time. But it's good tech to help improve the performance, the return that you actually get from staking Solana, so they actually outperform a lot of competitors, and that of course helps the product's performance over time.
I hope you'll keep us updated on any progress with that BSOL. Bradley, thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you so much, Stephen.
That's Bitwise Asset Management European Head Bradley Duke.